Hello there. I hope you are enjoying this biography in their own words, Helen Keller by George Sullivan so far. As I'm sure you could tell, Helen Keller is quite a remarkable historical figure that's very important. So let's continue. Chapter 3. One day, when Helen was 6 years old, her father took her to visit a doctor in Baltimore. The doctor examined Helen's eyes. Then he told Captain Keller that Helen would never see again. But the doctor was impressed with Helen. He found her to be a bright and lively child. He told Captain Keller that he believed that Helen could be taught just as other children. The doctor had a suggestion for Captain Keller. He told him to take Helen to Washington, D.C. to see Alexander Graham Bell. Does anybody remember who that is? Alexander Graham Bell was very famous. In 1876, when he was 29, Bell invented the telephone. He was also well known for his work with those with hearing impairments. He had once operated a school in Boston for teachers of people who had suffered hearing loss. Captain Keller arranged a meeting with Alexander Graham Bell in Washington, where he was carrying on his work with people who were deaf. Helen and Bell liked each other from the moment they met. Helen sat on Bell's lap, and he let her play with his pocket watch. People had pocket watches back then in the 1800s. It was like a little tiny watch, and you kept it in your pocket. He understood my signs, Helen would later write, and I knew it and loved him at once. Helen Keller and Alexander Graham Bell would remain friends until Bell's death in 1922. Bell advised Captain Keller to write to the Perkins Institute for the Blind in Boston. The Perkins Institution had opened in 1831. It was the first school in America for people who were blind. Perhaps they could suggest a teacher for Helen, Bell told Captain Keller. As soon as he returned home, Captain Keller did as Bell suggested and wrote to the Perkins Institution. Look, here's a photo of Alexander Graham Bell and Helen Keller. Not long after, the Kellers received a reply from Michael Anagos, the school's director. He told the Kellers that he had a teacher in mind for Helen. She was, said Anagos, exceedingly intelligent, strictly honest, industrious, and ladylike in her manner. Besides that, she was familiar with the methods of teaching deaf, mute, and blind children. The teacher's name was Anne Sullivan. Anne Sullivan's parents were immigrants from Ireland. They had settled in western Massachusetts near Springfield. Anne, the oldest of the 5 Sullivan children, was born in 1866. When she was 5, Anne developed a serious eye disease. It was not properly treated. She became almost blind as a result. Anne was 10 when she and a younger brother were sent to an institution in Tewksbury, Massachusetts, that provided for people who were needy and disabled. There, life was difficult, even tragic. Her brother became ill and died. One day, officials from the state of Massachusetts visited the institution. Anne flung herself at the group, pleading for a chance to go to school. In 1880, the teenaged Anne became a student at Perkins Institution for the Blind. While at Perkins, Anne came to know Laura Bridgman, a woman in her 50s. Laura was the first person to be educated in the United States who was deaf and blind. To communicate with Laura, students at Perkins would form letters through the touch of their fingers into the palm of her hand. These letters together made up what is called the manual alphabet. The manual alphabet is very similar to the sign language alphabet used by people who are deaf. So instead of doing signs with their hands, they do the signs in their hands so people could feel them. Anne Sullivan learned to fingerspell using the manual alphabet during her years at Perkins. Doing so enabled her to speak with Laura Bridgman and some other people who were deaf-blind. As she got to know Laura, Anne felt sorry for her. Laura spent her days sewing and praying. She had no life outside the school. In 1886, when she was 20 years old, Anne graduated from Perkins. Her eyes had been operated on twice while she was attending the school. These operations had greatly improved her eyesight. So here's a picture of Laura Bridgman, who was the first deaf-blind person to be educated in America. Just the one with the glasses. Anne was ready to set out on her own, but she had no idea of how she was going to earn a living. Then Anne heard from Michael Aganos, the director of the Perkins School. Mr. Aganos wanted to know if she would like to become a private teacher. Her only pupil would be a girl who was deaf-blind in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Anne had doubts about herself. She didn't know whether she could teach a disabled child, but Mr. Aganos had faith in her. He said she could do the job if she made up her mind to do it. Captain Keller then wrote to Anne. He invited her to come to Tuscumbia. He said that the Kellers would pay her $25 a month and treat her as one of the family. $25 a month seems like a very good salary to Anne. Mind you, this was back in the 1800s. $25 meant a lot more than it would these days. So, in March 1887, Anne set out by train for Tuscumbia. In her suitcase, she carried a doll, a gift for Helen from the students at Perkins. After a long trip, Anne finally arrived in Tuscumbia. Mrs. Keller and her stepson James were at the station to greet her. Anne and the Kellers got into a horse-drawn carriage for the drive to the Keller home. As they drove, Anne noticed that Tuscumbia looked like the New England villages she remembered from her childhood days. The dirt roads cut through plowed fields, the fruit trees were in blossom. As they got closer to the Keller house, Anne became more and more excited. I could scarcely sit still, she once recalled. I felt like getting out and pushing the horse faster. Chapter 4, Wild Child. Helen had a feeling that something important was going to happen that day. Her mother had spent the morning hurrying about the house. Early in the afternoon, she felt her mother put on her hat and her gloves. That was a signal to Helen that her mother was going somewhere. Helen wanted to go with her. She tugged at her mother's skirt, but Mrs. Keller gently brushed her aside. Then she went off in the carriage. James went with her. Helen sat on the steps of the front porch and waited for her mother to return. She didn't know that a stranger was arriving. Helen didn't like strangers. It made no difference to Helen that the stranger was Anne Sullivan, whom the family would call Annie. It didn't matter that Annie was coming all the way from the Perkins Institution in Boston to try to help her. Late in the afternoon, Helen felt approaching footsteps. It was Anne Sullivan. Helen thought it was her mother. She put out her arms, but it wasn't her mother. It was a stranger. Just keep in mind, they had no way to communicate to Helen that they hired Anne Sullivan to come teach her. She had no idea. Helen felt the stranger's arms coil around her. She kicked and twisted and struggled to get away. Although Helen was fearful of strangers, she was also very curious about them. She approached Annie Sullivan again. She suddenly snatched Annie's handbag and began to go through it, searching for candy. When her mother took the handbag away, Helen burst into a rage. She screamed and rolled on the grass. Annie did not know that this was quite normal behavior for Helen. She did not know that Helen was a wild child. If Helen did not get her way, a tantrum was the result. She would fling herself on the ground and let out ear-piercing screams. Helen's mother did not even try to control her. Helen's tantrum did not discourage Annie. The day after Annie arrived, she began Helen's first lesson. Annie planned to teach Helen to spell using the finger alphabet that she had learned at the Perkins Institution. Here's a picture of Anne Sullivan, Helen Keller's teacher, in 1887, which is the year that she went to go teach Helen Keller. She took the doll that the children at the Perkins had given Anne as a gift for Helen. Annie placed the doll in Helen's hand. Helen liked it. She hugged it. Then Annie took one of Helen's hands and spelled out the letters D-O-L, or doll, in Helen's palm. Next, she took Helen's hand and stroked it lightly over the doll. Annie then repeated the lesson, first spelling out the word doll in Helen's palm, then brushing her hand over the doll. Helen seemed to catch on. She began to imitate what Annie was doing. Slowly, she spelled out the letters D-O-L in Anne's hand. But Helen did not really understand. I did not know that I was spelling a word or that words even existed, Helen would later recall. I was simply making my fingers go in a monkey-like imitation. The second word that Annie tried to teach Helen was cake. She spelled the word into Helen's hand. Then she gave her a piece of cake. Helen gobbled it down, but she did not understand the connection between the word and the cake itself. Helen had no idea that Annie was her teacher. She didn't know that Annie was there to instruct her. All she knew was that the stranger was trying to make her do things that she sometimes did not like to do. One morning at the breakfast table, Helen and Annie clashed bitterly. Family meals at the Keller home were seldom quiet and orderly. Helen was permitted to wander around the table and take whatever she wanted from anyone's plate. But Annie refused to allow Helen to take food from her plate. When Helen reached for a piece of food, Annie slapped her hand. Helen reached again. Annie slapped her hand again. Helen screamed and burst into a tantrum. Annie asked Helen's mother and father to leave the room. She locked the door behind them and went back to eat her breakfast. Helen was still down on the floor, kicking and screaming. She stopped screaming long enough to try to jerk Anne's chair out from under her. When she was unable to unseat Annie, she got up to find out what was happening. When she realized that Annie was eating, she tried to snatch a piece of food from her plate. Annie slapped her hand once again. Helen got back at her by pinching Annie's arm. Annie slapped her hand again. Helen pinched her back. Annie slapped her hand once more, and so it went slap, pinch, slap, pinch. So instead of having Helen sit at the table like everyone else, since she was deaf and blind, her parents just let her roam around the kitchen table and grab food off everyone's plates. Interesting, huh? Tiring of the game, Helen made her way around the table, touching all of the chairs. When she found that they were empty, she seemed puzzled. She went back to her own chair and sat down. She began eating her breakfast with her fingers. Annie gave her a spoon. Helen threw it on the floor. Annie forced Helen out of her chair and made her pick up the spoon. When she got Helen back into her chair, Annie made her take the spoon in her hand. After more struggling, Helen finally began to eat her breakfast with the spoon. So Anne Sullivan is teaching Helen how to sit at the table and eat properly, like everybody else. There was another quarrel over folding the napkin. When she had finished eating, Helen threw her napkin on the floor and ran for the door. What would your parents do if you did that? See, So Helen's no different. When she found it was locked, she kicked and screamed. Annie led her back to the table and made her sit down. Then Annie presented her with her napkin and made Helen understand that she was to fold it. It took a total hour. When the job was done, though, Annie opened the door. Helen ran out into the warm sunshine. Annie went to her room. She was worn out. She felt beaten. She threw herself down on her bed and wept. It's the end of chapter 4. But as you can see, so Helen, since she was deaf and blind, her parents kind of let her do whatever she wanted because of her disability. But when Anne Sullivan came into the picture, Anne was kind of like, oh no, like you are just like any other kid and you are going to follow the same rules. So stay tuned so we can find out how Helen starts to react to her new teacher, Anne Sullivan. Stay tuned.